Good morning, Ms. Molefe. Good morning, everybody.
Good morning, Chair.
Thank you. Are you ready?
We are ready to start, Chair.
Yes.
Thank you, Chair. The next witness whom we will be calling is Mr. Chetan Vagela, who is an audit partner employed at the auditing firm Deloitte. In brief, Chair, the evidence of Mr. Vagela relates to the audit conducted by Deloitte into the agreements and transactions between Neo Tel and Tommix. The Chair has heard evidence from several Transnet employees as well as former employees relative to these transactions. The Chair has also most recently heard evidence by the Reserve Bank relative to these transactions as well. Chair, in his evidence, Mr. Vagela will testify on the commerciality of the transaction between Neo Tel and Tommix from an audit perspective. And in this respect, Mr. Vagela will testify mainly to the background to the audit conducted and the investigation by Deloitte. He will also testify to the different reports made to the independent regulatory body for auditors relative to their investigation. Might the witness be sworn in, Chair?
Thank you.
Please state your full names for the record.
Chetan Chagan Vagela.
Do you have any objections to making the prescribed affirmation?
No.
Do you solemnly affirm that all the evidence that you will give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? If so, please raise your right hand and say, I solemnly affirm.
I solemnly affirm.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you,
You
Chair.
can go ahead, yeah.
We will be dealing with the bundle before the Chair, which has been marked Exhibit BB9.
The live arch file containing Mr. Chetan Vagela's statement will be marked Exhibit BB9.
Thank you, Chair. Mr. Vagela, for the record, could you please spell your name and surname?
Chetan Vaghela.
Thank you. Please refer to the exhibit marked BB9, which is before you. And can you refer to page 1 to 28 of that exhibit? Is that your statement to the Commission?
Yes, it is, Chair.
And on page 28 of that exhibit, is that your signature appearing on that page?
Yes, it is, Chair.
The date of the 16th of April 2019, is that the date on which you wrote the statement?
Yes, it is, Chair.
Are there any corrections you wish to effect to your statement?
Yes, Chair. If I can bring your attention to page 3, paragraph 7.8. The date in Urbe, the acting CFO, was appointed in July 2015. And XK Mamani.
I'm sorry, would you please just raise your voice a bit more?
Okay.
Yes.
Paragraph 7.8.
Yes.
Urbe, the acting CFO, was appointed in July 2015 and not 30 November 2015.
Yes.
In paragraph 7.9, XK Memani, Director in Charge, was appointed in July 2015 and not 30 November 2015.
Are there any other corrections?
Chair, if we can go to page 15. In the top paragraph, the last sentence, a copy of the correspondence with Transnet is attached as CV 7.1. That should be a reference to page 97 under bundle CV 14.
Thank you, Chair. A supplementary
Do you understand
statement. I understand Mr. Vagela to be saying that the reference to CV 7.1 should instead be CV 14, page 97.
Is that correct, Mr. Vagela?
Yes. Yes, Chair.
CV 14.
Yes, Chair.
Okay.
Thank you, Chair. A supplementary statement will be prepared by Mr. Vagela in due course.
Yes, okay.
Thank you, Chair. Mr. Vagela, do you now confirm the correctness of your statement?
Yes, I do, Chair.
Thank you. What qualifications do you hold?
Chair, I'm an audit partner at Deloitte & Touche. I've been with the firm for over 19 years, of which 7 years from telecommunications, media, and technology industry sector. I have been involved in the Neo Tel audit since its inception, in the role as a senior manager, and subsequently from years 2012 in the role as a partner. For the audit of 2015, I was one of the partners, together with Mr. Andre Denis being the signing partner.
Thank you. Mr. Vagela, can you please move the mic closer to you so that you don't have to lean forward every time you need to speak into the mic? Is that better?
Yes, thank you.
What do you currently do?
I'm currently still an audit partner with Deloitte & Touche.
Yes. Can we then turn to page 2 of your statement? From paragraph 4 of your statement, you set out the background upon which audits were conducted on Neo Tel, and you have stated in your opening that it was Deloitte that conducted this audit. Is that correct?
Yes, as joint auditors.
And during which period was the audit conducted?
The audit ordinarily runs from February through to May in 2015.
And can you confirm the position you held during this audit?
I was an audit partner on the Neo Tel engagement.
Who were the directors of Neo Tel during the 2015 financial year?
Chair, the directors of Neo Tel at the time were Mr. Baweja, who had resigned on the 4th of November 2014, Mr. Dhawan, Mr. Joshi, who had resigned on the 30th of November 2015, Mr. Kumar, Mr. Mimani, Mr. Ndoroma, who had resigned on the 28th February 2014, Mr. Offner was appointed on the 4th of November 2014, Mr. Pham, who was appointed on the 4th of November 2014, Mr. Ranade, Mr. Srinath, and Mr. Tsaluba.
And do you know what positions those board members held during that period?
They were all directors of the company.
And who was the CEO at that point?
The CEO was Mr. Joshi, and at the time, and during the period, Mr. Mimani subsequently became the director in charge.
And who was the chairman of the board?
And the chairman was Mr. Srinath.
And who were the members of the auditing committee during the 2015 financial year?
The members of the audit committee chair were Mr. Mimani, Mr. Pham, and Mr. Offner.
And who were the persons constituting Neo Tel's management?
The persons constituting management were Mr. Joshi as CEO, Mr. Wiley as CFO, Mr. Theko as company secretary, Mr. R. Bucks as acting CFO, and Mr. Mimani as director in charge.
Yes, let us then turn to page 4 of your statement. From paragraphs 8 to 14 of your statement, you introduce the background to what you have titled the Tommix transaction. In which year was this transaction audited?
During the course of the audit for the year ended 31 March 2015.
And what brought about the audit of this transaction?
Chair, during the audit of Neo Tel for the year ended 31 March 2015, there were significant accounting and auditing issues that we were engaging management on. They were also subject to an acquisition by Vodacom, and as a result of the circumstances, management had put us under a tighter timetable for the audit compared to previous years. As a result of the tight timelines, we seek to amend the timing of our audit procedures, particularly around the verification of trade creditors. We ordinarily test trade creditors in April based on the 31 March balances. For the 2015 audit, we moved the timing to test creditors in March based on the 28 February balances. During the performance of these procedures, we perform a routine test in analyzing trade creditors. And specifically, we compare the current year balances to the prior year. We look for significant movements. We look at new creditors or creditors not recurring, as well as a new significant debit balances. During this review, we identified Tommix as a new vendor that had a significant debit balance to the amount of approximately 41 million rand. In reviewing the audit documentation documented by our trainees, they referred to this amount being relating to a commission that was payable in terms of the binding Transnet deal. In line with the terms of the agreement, a certain percentage of the deal was payable to Tommix by the end of February 2015. As at the end of February, Neo Tel had not yet received an invoice for the amount, yet payment had to be made in terms of the contract. On the 27th of February 2015, an amount of 41 million rand was paid to Tommix. These circumstances and the nature of this creditor made us very skeptical around this balance. And the reason we became skeptical is because it was new to the company. The vendor was not known. It had never been disclosed to us in our conversations with management. They were unusual. And we had just, ordinarily we perform quarter review procedures in December, and we were aware of the Transnet contract being concluded and awarded to Neo Tel, but there was no mention of Tommix used in previous discussions. And so when we picked it up in our March testing, it seemed very unusual to us. Chair, to just sketch the scene, Transnet was a customer of Neo Tel, and the contract, the existing master service agreement was ending in that year, and Neo Tel and Transnet both needed to conclude the contract, and we were aware that they were under negotiation. So when we picked up the matter, I escalated it to Mr. Denis because we were quite skeptical around the nature of this vendor, and he suggested that we use our forensics departments to do some background checks and due diligence. And that's because, this information was withheld. It was not fully disclosed, and we didn't know who they were. We also called for the vendor onboarding documentation, which is a process that the company Neo Tel has when they use vendors and when they onboard them and do their own background checks. When we looked at that information, it was incomplete and raised a number of red flags. And that, together with our own internal checks, left us with quite a bit of concern around the Tommix transactions.
Now, at this point of the audit process, what information or documentation did Deloitte rely on?
At this point in time, we had relied on the age analysis, inquiries made of finance staff, the vendor onboarding documentation, and we did have at the time the consultancy agreements.
Yes. From what follows in your statement is set out from paragraphs 15 to 31, which is Deloitte's investigation into the Tommix transaction. And you have stated that this relates to the 2015 financial year. And what in particular did the audit seek to establish?
Chair, the audit seeks to establish the commerciality around the fees paid to Tommix. We wanted to know who Tommix was, what did they do, and what was their mandate in concluding the Transnet contract. We wanted to understand the commerciality of the fees paid for the services, the alleged services rendered.
And in your audit, did you meet with anyone rather from Neo Tel?
Yes, Chair. Following our concerns, we met with various members of management in our inquiries around the transaction. We met with Mr. Wiley on the 9th of April, and we raised our concern around the Tommix transaction. We wanted to know who Tommix was, who had engaged with Tommix, and what did they do, as well as who their shareholders and directors were. In that meeting, Mr. Wiley did not know who Tommix was, but he did mention that there were 2 payments made to Tommix in the 2015 financial year. Mr. Wiley then explained that during early December, the negotiations with Transnet around the Master Services Agreement had come to an impasse. Members of management within Neo Tel got together, and Mr. Joshi, the CEO, suggested that they engage with Tommix, the agent, to help them overcome this impasse. Tommix was known to them because they previously had brought a Cisco deal earlier in the year. Mr. Wiley then went on to explain that the company had done their own background checks and there were no red flags noted around the payments and Tommix. He then explained that Deloitte then contested that our background checks indicated otherwise, as the company was in deregistration. Mr. Wiley also then pointed out that if we needed further information around Tommix, we would need to see the CEO, Mr. Joshi. We then subsequently met Mr. Joshi on the 11th of April at the Fire and Ice Hotel in Melrose Arch. Mr. Joshi reiterated the same fact pattern as Mr. Wiley, in that they had reached an impasse and they had engaged Tommix to assist them resolve the impasse and conclude the deal.
Yes, before you go on further, just to remind ourselves, Mr. Wiley was the Chief Financial Officer of Neo Tel, is that correct?
Yes, that is correct, Chair.
I would also like to refer you back to page 4 of your statement at paragraph 10, where you read out the findings of your trainees during the early stages of the audit. In the second last sentence of the quotation on page 4, at paragraph 10, you read there that this has been raised as a debit balance until such time that the invoice is received. Just in simple layman's terms, what would a debit balance refer to in this context?
Chair, in this context, the payment had been made before the invoice had been received, which resulted in a debit balance in creditors.
Thank you. You were then going to take the chair through the meeting that took place with officials of Neo Tel, or rather employees of Neo Tel. And as I have it, that appears from paragraph 32 of your statement. On what date did this meeting take place?
Chair, sorry, if I can draw the council to paragraph 25, because that's where we had the meetings with the CEO.
Thank you. Paragraph 25, that appears on page 7. On what date did this meeting take place?
The meeting with the CEO took place on the 11th of April 2015.
Yes, and what was the purpose of that meeting?
The purpose of the meeting was to understand more around who Tommix was and what did they do in resolving the alleged impasse, and to further understand the commerciality of the fees.
Now, was this meeting recorded in writing?
Yes, we do have minutes of our meetings that we took as our evidence for our audit files.
Can I then refer you to page 30 of the bundle, which is under folder number 1, Chair? Would that be a copy of the minutes of your first meeting with Neo Tel?
Yes, Chair.
And who recorded these minutes?
These minutes would have been recorded by the senior manager on the job, Michelle Viljoen, and myself.
Yes, please take the chair through the minutes of this meeting. Starting with who was in attendance at this meeting.
Chair, in attendance at this meeting was Andre Denis as the LCSP, Chetan Vagela as an engagement partner, Michelle Viljoen as the senior manager, and Mr. Wiley as the CFO.
Can you just clarify what LCSP stands for?
He's the lead client service partner.
Thank you. And what was discussed at this meeting?
So at that meeting, we explained our concern around Tommix. We wanted to understand the commerciality and what Tommix did, and we were unaware of the use of an agent in concluding the master services agreement.
The payments that you were questioning, what were the amounts of these payments?
The amount that was under question was 36 million rand, excluding VAT.
And was there any other amount that you were considering?
At the time, no. However, the CFO did mention that there was a previous payment made to Tommix regarding the Cisco deal, which we then subsequently went and investigate.
And did you discuss the involvement of Tommix insofar as who introduced Tommix to Neo Tel?
We did discuss Tommix. However, the information was very limited in that the CFO did not know who Tommix was. He was aware that they had brought a previous deal to Neo Tel, and on the recommendation of the CEO, they engaged Tommix, and Tommix helped them close the deal.
And was there any other discussion insofar as the payment to Tommix in relation to the authority to make such payment?
Not at the time with the CFO, Chair. So did the CFO, Mr. Stephen Wiley, say he didn't know who Tommix was?
Yes, Chair, the CFO did not know who Tommix was.
Well, you deal a lot with CFOs and companies as an auditor.
Yes, I do, Chair.
If you look at the amount that had been paid to Tommix and you look at the size of Neo Tel, did it strike you as strange that the CFO of the company wouldn't know who Tommix was, even though a lot of money had been paid to Tommix, as I understand the position?
Yes, Chair, it would. That is correct. It would strike us as unusual that the CFO would not know who Tommix is, particularly for the quantum and the nature of the activity in relation to the Transnet MSA.
Because you were having that meeting in April 2015, and according to the minutes that we are looking at, in October 2014, approximately 30 million rand the entity to which they were paying such a lot of money.
Yes, that is correct, Chair. That it would be of a concern.
Yes. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Chair. At paragraph 10 of your statement, which appears on page 4, the quotation you're reading, insofar as the trainee's findings, makes reference to an amount of just over 41 million having been paid on the 27th of February 2015. And in these minutes, and as the Chair has just pointed out, there was reference made to two payments of 30 million and 36 million, which on my calculation is a total of 66 million. So can you please just clarify what exact amounts were paid as discovered by Deloitte?
Yes, Chair. When we identified Tommix, the payment under question was the 36 million rand ex-VAT, which amounts to the 41 million rand noted on page 4. In the inquiries with the CFO, he then mentioned that a previous payment was made, which we had not picked up in our routine testing. And when we further went and investigated that payment, there was a payment of 30 million rand relating to a Cisco deal done earlier. So that's the two differences. The 41 million rand related to the Transnet MSA, and the 30 million rand which was paid earlier for a deal regarding a sale of equipment.
In terms of the normal duties of a CFO in a company of this size as Neo Tel, wouldn't the CFO have had to satisfy himself before payments of this size were made to anybody? Wouldn't he or she have had to satisfy himself that there was a proper reason for the payment of the money if they'd done work, that they had actually performed work and that that work had been done to Neo Tel's satisfaction and so on?
Chair, yes, we would expect a CFO to understand who they're dealing with, what is the nature of the service that was rendered, to command fees of such magnitude, what work was actually done. We would expect some understanding and interrogation around that on behalf of the company.
Wouldn't a CFO have had to approve that kind of payment normally for this size of company, or is it something that could have gone without his authorization, that payments of this size?
Yes, it would need to be approved by the CFO, and in this case, as well as the CEO.
And in this case, did you establish whether the CFO had actually authorized these payments that had already taken place?
It had been authorized under his finance department.
Yes, so he would need to take responsibility for it.
Yes.
Yes. But when you say under his department, is that because you are not sure whether he personally got involved in the authorization, or is that because you do know that he didn't get personally involved, but somebody else did get personally involved?
Chair, it's the latter, in that if you look at the evidence, his signature won't be on the payment approval, but it's...
His signature was or wasn't on the...
On the second payment, on the 36 million rand payment.
Yes.
His signature is not on the payment approval.
Yes.
But it's within his department, so he was aware.
Yes.
In the first payment on the 30 million rand, both the CEO and CFO had approved that payment as a once-off vendor payment.
Yes. So at least in regard to the first payment, he knew and approved of the payment, and therefore it's quite strange that he could approve payment of 30 million rand to an entity that he said he didn't know much about, didn't know anything about.
That is
am I being unfair to him?
No, that is, your question is valid, and we had the same questions ourselves, hence the concern around Tommix and the inquiries that we made of the CFO, CEO, and CEO.
And did you say you asked him what exactly Tommix had done? Is that right?
Yes, we did.
And all he said was something along the lines that Tommix helped them to break an impasse with Transnet.
Yes, that's right, and they concluded the deal.
Yeah, but he didn't tell you exactly what it is they did.
Yes, that's correct, Chair.
Okay, all right, thank you.
Thank you, Chair. And Mr. Vagela, you deal with issues relating to the delegation of authority in later parts of your statement. The meeting that you have just taken the chair through, or the minutes of the meeting you have taken the chair through, you summarize at paragraph 17 to 23, is that correct?
Uh, 16 to 23, Chair.
Thank you. And did you hold another meeting with Neo Tel?
Yes, Chair. We then, after the meeting with the CFO, we then had a meeting with the CEO. As the CFO had said that if we wanted more information on Tommix, we need to engage with the CEO. We met with the CEO on the 11th of April, 2015.
And the CEO was?
The CFO was, the CEO is Mr. Joshi.
Yes. Okay.
Yes, and when did this meeting take place?
On the 11th of April, 2015.
And who was in attendance at the meeting?
In that meeting was Mr. Denis, myself, Mr. Wiley, and Mr. Joshi.
Can I refer you to page 32 of the bundle and folder number 2 of that exhibit BB9?
What page?
Page 32, Chair. It
Thank you.
appears under folder number 2. What is that document that appears on that page?
It is the minutes of our meeting on that day.
And who recorded these minutes?
It would be myself.
And can you then take the chair through the discussion that took place at this meeting?
Chair, at this meeting, Mr. Denis raised the matter around the Tommix transaction, and we wanted to know who Tommix was and further information around what they did. The CEO at the time reiterated the same fact pattern as was told to us by the CFO. He mentioned that in early December, the tensions with Transnet escalated and they came to a halt. There was an impasse and Transnet weren't prepared to negotiate any further on the Transnet MSA.
Sorry if I might just interject. When you refer to early December, is that early December 2014?
Yes, Chair.
Please continue.
So the negotiations came to an impasse, and as a result of that, the members of management of Neo Tel came together, and in that meeting they needed help, and Mr. Joshi was reminded of Tommix, and he suggested that they engage Tommix to assist them resolve the impasse. He advised us in the meeting that Tommix wanted 10% of the deal, and they couldn't afford the 10%, and they negotiated it down to 2%. In that meeting, Mr. Denis asked Mr. Joshi who engaged Tommix, with whom did Neo Tel deal at Tommix, what was the mandate, and who were Tommix supposed to engage with at Transnet, and did Mr. Singh, the Transnet CFO at the time, know who Tommix was, and that Transnet was engaging with an agent, and the extent of the fee paid to the agent. The CEO, Mr. Joshi, responded that he did not know who Tommix was and he did not engage with Tommix in any manner. He also mentioned at the time that the company had done their own background checks into the payments made to Tommix, and in their view the payments were valid and the reasons for the payments were valid. The CEO said he was introduced to Tommix by the Neo Tel's General Manager Strategic Customers, Mr. Francois van der Merwe, and the communication between Neo Tel and Tommix took place through Mr. van der Merwe as the key contact person within Neo Tel in respect of Tommix engagements. Mr. Denis also asked Mr. Joshi at the time that did he have board approval, and Mr. Joshi replied that he did, and he would send a note to Mr. Denis. Mr. Denis indicated further that Deloitte had concerns about the payments made to Tommix and that the Deloitte audit team needed to understand the commerciality of the fee paid and required support that the payment was not a facilitation payment, which could bring the Transnet Master Service Agreement into question. Because of the above inquiries, we became highly we were highly skeptical about the Tommix transactions, and we were suspicious about the commercial validity of those transactions, and we needed more evidence to support these fees paid.
At the stage of your interaction with Neo Tel, had you been furnished with any invoices upon which these payments had been made?
We did have the invoice. We also did have the contract. The contract was dated in February 2015, whereas the alleged service was rendered in December. So the contract was put after the event, but we did have those documentation. But we were very skeptical, and we increased our professional skepticism because we really wanted to know what they did. And we were looking through the documentation to say, what did Tommix do? We had an impasse on the 11th of December. We engaged them on the 12th of December, and Neo Tel had signed the contract on the 14th of December. Transnet signed it on the 19th. So when one looks at that timeline, we really wanted to understand what did Tommix do to warrant the payment of such fees.
And what was the nature of work or services said to have been done or provided on the invoices?
Chair, sorry, I can't answer that without recollecting the invoice, which I'm not sure if it's in the pack.
Okay, we will deal with that at a later.
Before that, so you have a situation where you ask the CFO, who is Tommix, and the CFO says, I don't know them. And then you meet with the CEO, you say, who is Tommix? He also says he doesn't know them. Is that correct?
That is correct, Chair.
And at this meeting with Neo Tel, was there ever any discussion in relation to the board of Transnet?
Sorry, Chair, can you rephrase the question?
At this meeting, which you've recorded at page 32, was there any discussion between yourselves and Neo Tel in relation to Transnet's board?
Chair, no discussion in relation to Transnet's board. We only raised the question that was Transnet aware that an agent, that Neo Tel had engaged an agent. And the reason for that question is because in our general knowledge and understanding of transacting with such entities, generally there is a clause that prohibits the use of agents unless disclosed. And therefore, based on that knowledge, we raised the question.
Yes.
So the CFO couldn't tell you what exactly Tommix had done, other than to say they helped to break the impasse between Neo Tel and Transnet. Did you ask the CEO the same question, and what was his answer if you did?
Chair, we did ask him the same question, and he answered in the same way as the CFO.
Yes.
That they resolved an impasse.
Yes.
But they could
But
not.
you didn't ask for details, or did you ask for details?
We
Say
did
what
ask for
exactly.
we did ask for details, Chair.
Yes, and what was the answer?
They couldn't tell us what they specifically did, other than resolving the impasse.
Thank you. And they said the person at Transnet that you could talk to who was dealing with Tommix was Mr. van der Merwe.
And Mr. van der Merwe was the person at Neo Tel.
Yeah,
He was the Neo Tel general manager that looked after the Transnet account.
yes.
And he engaged with Tommix on behalf of Neo Tel.
But I thought you also asked them, according to the minutes, who at Transnet has been dealing with Helmick, or did I misread the minutes?
We did ask that question, but
Yes.
I think, Chair, in the minutes, when we talk about Francois van der Merwe, he is a Neo Tel employee.
Or
Yeah. The minutes, when they say GM Transnet, it's actually, he's the general manager, but he looked after the Transnet account for Neo Tel.
so the minutes are not correct in attaching him to Transnet?
It is, it's just, it may be misleading, but he is the general, yeah.
Or he's
He's-
at Neo Tel, he was at Neo Tel, but dealing with Transnet
Yes, that's
on
correct.
behalf of Neo
Of-
Tel.
Yes, that's correct, Chair.
Okay, you never got to know who at Transnet knew about Helmick?
No, they could never tell us
Yes.
who they dealt with at
Yes.
Transnet. But we did ask the question that did the Transnet CFO
Yes.
know about Tommix? And we can come later to, there's a Transnet letter that will indicate, will give more facts around that Transnet did know about Tommix.
Yes. Okay, all right. We proceed. Yeah.
Thank you, Chair. Can I refer you to page 199 of the bundle? It's the last page in the exhibit. Are you able to identify that document?
Yes, Chair, it's the invoice from Tommix on the 36 million rand.
And is this the invoice you were furnished with during your engagement with Neo Tel?
Yes, Chair.
And what is the description provided in that invoice?
For Master Services Agreement, successful conclusion, success fee.
And the amount there is 36 million.
Yes, that's correct, Chair.
And what is the date of that invoice?
The date is 2nd January 2015.
You have summarized detail regarding your second meeting with Neo Tel from,
Just 1 second. I see that it says success fee there. Is that right?
Yes, Chair.
So that suggests that the 36 million rand that Helmick was demanding payment of from Neo Tel was a success fee.
Yes, Chair, it would appear so.
In one of your meetings with Neo Tel, either with the CFO only or with the CFO and the CEO, you asked, or your colleague asked, whether this payment was not a facilitation fee. And I think there was a denial that it was a facilitation fee, if I recall correctly. One, am I correct in saying there was a denial that it was a facilitation fee? Two, irrespective of the answer to that question, what would be the difference in your experience between a success fee and a facilitation fee in the context of the conclusion of a contract?
Chair, I think a fee any fee needs to have some sort of activity, and one needs to have done something in order to earn those fees. And whilst there was no acceptance around the alleged facilitation fee, the management could not articulate what was done to earn those fees. And we raised our concern that it would appear we needed more evidence to negate that this isn't a facilitation fee, because based on what we were seeing, it appeared to be as such. And I think it boils down to between success fees or facilitation fees, one needs to one needs to dig deeper as to what activity and what tasks did the service provider perform, and understand the commerciality behind that.
Well, what I'm seeking to establish is whether, in terms of your understanding and experience with these matters as an auditor, there would be a distinction between what is called a success fee and a facilitation fee in the context of the conclusion of a contract. Here we do know that there's a contract that was concluded between Transnet and Neo Tel, and that the CFO and CEO of Neo Tel told you that the role of Tommix was to help break an impasse which led to the conclusion of the contract between Transnet and Neo Tel. So when you asked them, that is the CEO and CFO, or one of them, whether the payment was not a facilitation fee, you obviously had in mind certain features by which you identify a facilitation fee. So I'm asking whether the features of a facilitation fee are different from the features of a success fee.
Chair, I guess to answer that question, when looking at it, it's not just the invoice, it was all the facts surrounding the vendor, and whether one calls it ordinarily no one would call it a facilitation fee. You would always rename it something else, either a commission or a success fee.
They might not call it a facilitation fee, but you know
Yes.
how you identify facilitation fee, even if it is called by another name. And my question is whether there is a difference in the features of a facilitation fee and in the features of a success fee.
Chair, in our mind, to answer...
Or whether it is one and the same thing, just different names being used, different words being used.
Yes, I think irrespective of what it's called, and I guess that's where we were, irrespective of what it is, what the fee is termed on the invoice, we needed to understand what the service provider did.
Yeah, but what is it that you identify in a transaction or in a payment that makes you conclude this is a facilitation fee? As I understand it, my own understanding is that in many times, a facilitation fee is like an agency fee, but that might not be the case in all cases. That might not apply in all cases, I'm not sure. So I'm just wondering whether, since you did ask this question to them, whether you knew what the features are for a facilitation fee, so that even if they denied that it was a facilitation fee, you'd still be able to say, we can see the features of this transaction. This was a facilitation fee. This denial is disingenuous.
Chair, I think to respond, I think there were various flags. When we looked at Tommix, the entity, there were discrepancies in the vendor onboarding documentation. The directors of that company were different to the people that they had engaged with. No one could articulate. When you looked at their website, there was an invalid web page. No one could articulate, no one could say who they actually dealt with. You could not name an individual. One couldn't articulate which elements of the MSA did they do. So it appeared as if it's just a shelf company, and when we did our own background searches, you couldn't get to a corporate entity that had an identity that could resolve an impasse. So I guess it's all those elements that we were working through at the time that led us to believe we had suspected that it was a facilitation fee at that point in time.
What is a facilitation fee? That's what I'm trying to establish.
Paying a fee for no value or no service.
Sorry?
Paying a fee for no value or no service would be, in my view.
It's a fee paid to somebody who has not rendered any service
Yes,
or who has not given you anything of value.
yes, Chair, that would be in my understanding.
Is that the normal understanding? Is that the normal kind of definition?
It's Chair, it's based on circumstances. I guess one needs to look at each case based on its merit, and then the circumstances.
But there must be something you have done which falls under facilitation. If you just give me money when I've done nothing, why would facilitation come in there if I'm not alleged to have facilitated anything?
Chair, I would, in our view, I would imagine that where one has not rendered a service and cannot substantiate the fees earned, it may allege to a facilitation payment.
If I facilitate a transaction and I maybe a sale, and I charge a fee to one of the parties or both, wouldn't that be a facilitation fee?
It may be, but we need to go down to what activities did that person perform in order to earn the fee.
Okay, you may proceed.
Thank you, Chair. Mr. Vagela, in your years of practice as an auditor, have you ever come across a facilitation fee arrangement, except the one under reference?
This would be my first one.
Okay. At paragraph 20 of your statement, you state there that Mr. Wiley indicated that the first payment to Tommix related to the Cisco equipment deal to Neo Tel, and you've given that evidence. Is that correct?
Sorry, Chair, Council, which paragraph are you referring
Paragraph
to?
20 on page 7.
And the question is?
The first payment that is said to have been made to Tommix, what was that payment?
It's for the Cisco equipment deal.
Can I then refer you back to page 199 of the bundle, which is the invoice we were looking at a few minutes ago? And we are going to cross-reference that with paragraph 10 of your statement at page 4. The date of this invoice, as you've told the Chair, is the 2nd of January 2015. Is that correct?
Yes, Chair.
And as you've earlier testified, a debit balance would relate to payment made before invoice. Do I have that correctly?
Yes, Chair.
Can you please then just explain, insofar as the date of this invoice, your paragraph 10 in relation to the debit balance, and what Mr. Wiley told you to have been the first basis of the first payment to Tommix? Was this the first payment to Tommix? Let me ask it differently.
Chair, no, this wasn't the first payment to Tommix.
Now, at paragraph 10, you speak of a payment being made on the 27th of February 2015, and you say that it was for an amount of just over 41 million. Is that correct?
Yes, Chair.
You also say that this payment was made before invoice. Is this correct?
Yes, Chair.
However, the invoice that you have referred us to at page 199 is dated the 2nd of January 2015.
Yes, Chair.
Can you please just explain how that would be a debit balance if, just by virtue of the date, it would have preceded this date of the 27th of February 2015.
Well, it depends on when it was actually received
Yes.
by Neo Tel
And
and how many versions there were, because there was another version of it.
Yes.
But in Neo Tel recording it at the time, they hadn't recorded this invoice. So it's quite possible that the invoice hasn't been received, although it's dated an earlier date.
And did Neo Tel ever confirm when this invoice was actually received from Tommix?
Chair, I can't answer that specifically. I don't recall the noting of the receipt of the invoice.
From paragraph 32 to 38 of your statement, you then set out details relevant to further investigations conducted by Deloitte. At the outset of that topic, you speak to events that took place on the 13th of April 2015. Is that correct?
Yes, Chair.
What happened on this day?
Following our inquiries with the CEO, we were advised to engage with Mr. van der Merwe, who was the primary contact between Neo Tel and Tommix. Myself and Ms. Viljoen at the time had a meeting with van der Merwe where we inquired about Tommix and their role in the Transnet MSA contract.
Can I refer you to page 34 of the bundle, which appears under the folder number 3. Can you please identify what document appears on page 34 of the bundle?
Chair, it's the minutes of meetings with Francois van der Merwe.
And who recorded these minutes?
Michelle Viljoen, the senior manager, and myself.
And what is the date on those minutes?
It's 13th April 2015.
25th, thank you. Who was in attendance at the meeting?
Michelle Viljoen, the senior manager, Francois van der Merwe, the general manager at Neo Tel, and myself.
Yes. And what was discussed at this meeting?
We inquired about Transnet. There were various transactions with Transnet, and we wanted to understand Tommix, as he had engaged with Tommix, and we wanted more information around who Tommix was and what they did. And so it was a third conversation following the CFO, CEO, and now the direct person.
Now, in the minutes, just under the second bullet point, starting with FVDM, there are certain contracts that are discussed there. Is that correct?
Yes, Chair.
Can you please just read those sub-bullets under the second bullet?
Okay, FDM provided an overview of all the Transnet transactions that took place in the current year. Routers and switches transaction in March 2014. CCTV1 in June, July 2014. The MSA sale of assets, mobilization, and CCTV2.
And on the sixth bullet, there is a discussion around the MSA process. Is that correct?
Yes, Chair.
Can you please take the chair through that discussion?
So in our discussion, Chair, Mr. van der Merwe provided an overview of the MSA process. He indicated that in November 2013, Neo Tel had lost the Transnet tender, and the tender was awarded to T-Systems. Neo Tel and Transnet signed an extension agreement that terminated in December 2014. In January 2014, Helmick sent a letter to FVDM notifying Neo Tel of a deal at Transnet that Neo Tel wasn't invited to tender for. That is how Neo Tel became aware of the routers and switches deal and how they became aware of Tommix. Neo Tel was made aware by their two people at Transnet, Kerry and Yusuf, that Transnet has an exit plan from Neo Tel, being Dimension Data. According to Mr. van der Merwe, Transnet had trust issues with Neo Tel. CV asked Mr. van der Merwe who Hommix were and their background.
Sorry, when you refer to the initial CV, please just confirm who that would be.
Myself, Chetan Vagela.
Thank you, please proceed.
He asked Mr. van der Merwe who Hommix were and their background. Mr. van der Merwe answered, Hommix is a Dubai-based company. They offered specialized consultancy services with staff of 100 employees. They have offices in South Africa, and their offices are based in Pretoria, Silverton, where Mr. van der Merwe has visited before. However, he usually meets Hommix at Melrose Arch. Hommix does a lot of work for Transnet and government. They play at board level.
Now, what was your understanding of what you've just stated there, where it says that they play at board level?
It alludes to influence and influencing higher levels of management.
Which management?
At a Transnet level.
Was this explained specifically by Mr. van der Merwe to you?
No, we just recorded what he told us.
Did you ask him what he meant by they play at board level?
No.
Okay, please proceed.
CV, which is myself, asked Mr. van der Merwe who does he deal with specifically at Hommix. Mr. van der Merwe replied that his contact person at Hommix is Ashok. He doesn't recollect his name, but he would send his details to me. According to Mr. van der Merwe, Ashok is the president of Hommix Middle East and African Business. Mr. van der Merwe also indicated that he could arrange a meeting for myself if we would like to meet him. I indicated that there was no need to meet him. Hommix was able to swing the MSA deal for Neo Tel because Transnet didn't sign a legally enforceable agreement with T-Systems. As the MSA stipulates, the supplier needs to be the sole supplier, which T-Systems at that point wasn't. Neo Tel contacts at Transnet with regards to the MSA are Gerry van der Westhuizen and Yusuf Mohammed. Should I continue?
On the following page, page 35,
Yeah.
the first sub-bullet that appears there, can you please take the chair through the discussion that took place in that respect?
Is that at the top of the page, Chair?
Page 35, the sub-bullet that appears, the first sub-bullet that appears at page 35, starting with the wheels.
The wheels came off on the 10th and 11th of December 2014. No one at Transnet was willing to talk to Neo Tel anymore. Neo Tel management tried to make contact with Transnet, and they were not taking their calls. The information received by Neo Tel through their sources was that there were talks with Data. A meeting between Sunil Joshi, Steve Wiley, Tracy Cohen, and Mr. van der Merwe was held during this impasse, where the decision to use Hommix was made by Sunil. Sunil Joshi sent an email to the Neo Tel people involved in this transaction suggesting making use of Hommix. Neo Tel negotiated with Hommix a fee of 2% of the MSA. Initially, they wanted 10%, which was consistent with the previous deal terms. However, this pricing was not acceptable to Neo Tel, as it would make the deal unprofitable. Mr. van der Merwe is expecting another payment of 20 million based on the asset sale, dependent on Transnet and Neo Tel signing the operational agreement. Neo Tel's new primary contact at Transnet is Helen Walsh and Cole Sisisquad, but that's an error.
Mr. van der Merwe, according to the minutes, offered to facilitate a meeting between you and Ashok from Hommix. And according to the minutes, you declined that invitation. Why did you decline it?
Chair, I declined the meeting because it wasn't in my ambit to make those inquiries at that level. It was for management to engage with Tommix and understand what they did.
No, but you wanted to understand because as auditors you wanted to see what you were dealing with, isn't it? That's my understanding. That's why you had a meeting with the CFO. That's why you had a meeting with the CEO. That's why you are now having a meeting with Van der Merwe, because you were told by the CEO that Van der Merwe was the contact person with Tommix. He would be the one who has information,
Yes.
isn't it?
Yes.
And now
Yes.
you have a chance, you meet with Van der Merwe, and he tells you what he tells you, and he says the person at Tommix that he was dealing with, because you wanted to know who he dealt with at Tommix, he says that person is Ashok. And he offers to arrange for a meeting between you and him. And you would have got a chance to say to Ashok, what exactly did you do that justifies this fee? And then you decline. That's what I don't understand.
Chair, at the time we were still making our inquiries, and so I didn't take the opportunity to engage Ashok at the time.
Yeah, but you were going to have a meeting with Ashok and make same inquiries that you have been making with the CFO, the CEO, and now with Van der Merwe. You want to know something, and from what I gather, the answers they were giving you were not satisfactory. Am I right?
Yes, Chair.
You're not getting what you were looking for from the CFO, from the CEO, from Van der Merwe. And now Van der Merwe says, I can arrange a meeting for you to meet with Ashok. And that's the person that at least should be able to tell you what he did or what his team did to justify this fee. And you decline. I don't understand why you declined that opportunity.
Chair, at the time he just referred to it as Ashok, and he said he would send us the full details of the name later. So once he had...
No, but he said, I can arrange. He knew Ashok. It's not like he wouldn't say, because he didn't remember the surname, he couldn't pick up the phone and say, I want you to meet my auditors, our auditors. He knew Ashok. He had met with him. He was dealing with him. And you were seeking certain answers. And he says, I can arrange a meeting. And you decline.
Chair, for us it was, at the time, it's a quick answer to say I can let you meet Ashok. In that instance, we wouldn't necessarily, at that point in time, take up the opportunity, because otherwise we wanted the Neo Tel board and management to articulate to us. So it's an element of one can further the inquiry, but it's a matter of timing during the audit process that one would take up the opportunity.
Did you later take that opportunity?
The opportunity was later taken up by Neo Tel when they commissioned the investigation.
It was taken up by?
By the company Neo Tel
Yes.
when they commissioned an independent investigation.
But you didn't take it?
No.
Yeah. Okay.
Thank you, Chair.
Maybe I can just say, part of the reason why you were asking these questions to the company was to enable you to decide whether what was happening was something that was reportable in terms of your obligations as an auditor, isn't it?
Yes, Chair.
And speaking to somebody from Tommix could help you to get information that would help you decide, is this reportable or not?
Yes, Chair.
Yes, okay.
Thank you, Chair. It is 11:15. I don't know if there's an opportune time to take the short adjournment.
We'll take the tea adjournment and we'll resume at 11:30.
Mr. Vagela, before the short adjournment, we were going through the minutes of the meeting that took place with Neo Tel, which you've recorded at page 34 of your bundle from 34 to 35. Earlier, the chair asked you why you did not meet with Mr. Ashok when the opportunity was presented to you. And you sought to explain to the chair why this was not necessary. At this point of your engagement with Neo Tel, what was the basis upon which you were engaging Neo Tel?
Chair, at the time we were still, our audit was a routine audit, a company audit, and in such circumstances, we wouldn't necessarily engage with creditors directly. Tommix was a creditor of Neo Tel, and we were still in the fact-finding process of our audit.
And as I understand it, the audit you were conducting was an audit on Neo Tel.
Yes, the audit we were conducting was the audit of the company, and not necessarily an investigation into the actual contracts. It's as part of our audit, we identified these contracts that we looked into further.
And in the normal course of an audit of a company, would you engage that company's creditors?
No, we would not directly engage the company's creditors.
Well, if you must satisfy yourself whether the transaction is reportable or not, and if your client, Neo Tel, is happy for you to speak to a creditor, and you have no reason to think the creditor has any problem, what would be wrong with saying, let me take this offer and talk to Ashok and see whether I can see what conclusion I can reach about whether this transaction is reportable or not.
Chair, there's nothing stopping that. It's just we were going through our process where at that point in time we didn't take the need to engage Ashok directly.
You see, that's my difficulty. Unless your position is you didn't have to satisfy yourself or that the transaction was reportable or not, number one, or unless you say there's nothing that Mr. Ashok could tell me that could help me make that decision. That's how I see it. But maybe there's something I don't understand. I'm not an auditor, so feel free to explain to me your thinking if there's anything other than what you have already told me that you can tell me to make me understand.
Chair, I'll take you through my thinking at the time. We were making inquiries of the different levels of management. To us, Tommix was an unknown entity and we couldn't understand what they had done. There were a lot of red flags, as I had mentioned earlier in my testimony, and the entity did not appear to have substance. And at the time of our inquiries, Amir gathered information around who he had engaged with. And at the time, Mr. van der Merwe only quoted Ashok. I don't know who that individual is. And we wanted to go back and do our own background checks investigation around that. We further wanted to understand what the company had done in performing their background checks, which I had a subsequent discussion on Tuesday, the 14th of April. And so we were going through our own process in collating information, in unpacking who were we dealing with and what information had the company had done around Tommix, and therefore I didn't take up the need. Subsequent to our background checks, and once we had received the information as to who Ashok was, in paragraph 33.1, Ashok he was referring to is Ashok Narayan Putanvidu. And when we, Denis and myself, were doing our own background checks, Ashok that was identified was linked to the Sahara group of companies, which is linked to the Gupta family. And so we were going through our own process at the time prior to engaging directly with creditors.
At the end of that meeting, did you have an understanding what Tommix had done to deserve these payments?
No, we had no further knowledge of exactly what they did.
But do you agree with me that somebody from Tommix certainly would have to answer that question to say, this is what we did? That person couldn't say, I don't know what we did to deserve that amount.
Yes, I agree with you, Chair, that someone would need to answer that question.
Yes.
But after that meeting, we did not have answers to the questions as to what they did.
You see, my understanding is that if in your meeting with Mr. van der Merwe, you got satisfactory answers, then that would explain why you wouldn't want to waste time and see somebody else, you know. But if you didn't get satisfactory answers, and he offered you somebody else that related to Tommix, who should know what Tommix did, it seems natural to say, yes, let's see him. It might be different if he is not prepared to be seen.
Chair, in this situation, we were getting the same fact pattern from the CFO, the CEO, the General Manager, Strategic Projects. And we were, the matter was significant, and it wasn't getting the attention that it deserved. And our subsequent steps was that actually Mr. Denis escalated the matter to the board of Neo Tel. So it wasn't for us to resolve the matter through our inquiries directly with Tommix. It was for the board of Neo Tel to understand what they commissioned Tommix to do, what did they do in resolving the impasse, and how did Neo Tel satisfy themselves that the fees were commensurate with the services. And therefore, in order to take the level of inquiry to another level, the inquiries were formalized in a letter to the board of Neo Tel. And therefore, that was our approach in dealing with the matter, rather than I myself engaging with Ashok.
Thank you, Chair. Can we go to page 35 of your bundle? At the second sub-bullet, which you earlier read out to the Chair, which says that Neo Tel negotiated with Tommix a fee of 2% of the MSA. Initially, they wanted 10%, which was consistent with previous deal terms. What were the previous deal terms referred to?
Chair, the previous deal referred to is the Cisco switches and routers deal.
And did you discuss when this negotiation with Tommix took place?
Not specifically with Mr. van der Merwe, but we, in our discussions with the CEO, we are aware that it took place on approximately the 12th of December.
Of 2014?
2014, yes, Chair.
And how did this meeting conclude?
The meeting with Mr. van der Merwe, he just articulated further information around CCTV 1 and CCTV 2. And as our meeting was a sort of a discussion around Transnet as a whole, as part of a routine audit discussion, we left the meeting as such, and we said Mr. van der Merwe needed to give me the full name of Ashok, And if there was any information that we needed, we would reach out to him.
And were you eventually provided with the full details of the person referred to as Ashok?
Yes, I was, Chair.
And what detail was provided?
He had provided his full name in an email to me, which was Ashok Narayan Putanvidu, as described in clause 33.1.
Can you please spell the name and surname of Mr. Ashok?
Ashok, A-S-H-O-K, Narayan, N-A-R-A-Y-A-N, Putanvidu, P-U-T-H-E-N-V-E-E-D-U.
And what did you do with these details once you obtained them?
Once we obtained them, we did some background searches on the internet to try and identify who the person potentially may be.
Yes, and who did you find the person to be?
Chair, through our searches, we potentially identified him as a director, ex-director of Sahara Group of Companies.
Yes, and what did you do with this information?
Chair, I was with Mr. Denis, and we shared the information between ourselves, and that's where we left that information. But we remain concerned. It increased our worry around the commerciality of the fees.
What increased your worry?
The person who Tommix was linked to just caused more doubt around the fees being paid and whether there was actually substance behind Tommix.
And why is that?
Just by virtue of who the party is, I mean, you know, that party or the persons, in our view, we struggle to understand what they would have done, and based on media knowledge and inferences, you know, there was a concern.
You say in paragraph 34 of your statement that Mr. Van Merwe said that Joshi had suggested to him that Neo Tel engage Tommix in respect of the Transnet MSA. Is that right?
Yes, Chair.
But I think in one of the minutes, Joshi had said to you he didn't know Tommix. And now, according to Van Merwe, he's the one that suggested that they use Tommix. Is that right?
Yes, Chair.
Did you understand that to be rather contradictory, or you understood it differently? The CFO said he didn't know who Tommix was. Joshi said he didn't know who Tommix was, as I understand in the minutes in the meeting that you had. But now Mr. Van Merwe says it's actually Mr. Joshi who suggested that Neo Tel should use Tommix.
Chair, yes, that is correct. The sequence of events is at the time of the impasse. Tommix had brought a previous deal to Neo Tel, which was in March, April 2014, and so he was aware of Tommix bringing a deal to the company. And when they were at this impasse, Joshi then he was reminded by Van der Merwe of Tommix. And then he said, okay, well, he suggested that let's get that agent to assist us. So he didn't know, when we asked him who Tommix was, he couldn't give us details, but he just knew, he knew of the reference point that Tommix was an agent that brought a deal to us, so that we are told, based on the inquiries that we had with management.
He knew of Tommix, and he knew that Tommix had had dealings with Neo Tel before. What he might not have known might be certain details about them, but he knew of them at the time he met with you.
Chair,
Mr. Joshi.
Chair, that's right. He knew that Tommix had brought the Cisco deal to Neo Tel. And he recommended that Mr. van der Merwe engage with Tommix for the impasse. But when we asked him who Tommix actually is, who are the individuals who deal with, he doesn't have that knowledge of the entity.
Okay.
Thank you, Chair. From paragraph 36 on page 10 of your statement, you deal with further engagements that Deloitte had with Neo Tel. That is paragraph 36. Please take the Chair through these engagements.
Yes, Chair. I then further engaged with the company secretary, Mr. Calvin Teko, as the CEO had advised that he had done background checks on Tommix, and there were no flags raised in terms of their own background checks. I wish to draw the Chair to page 95.
Before you do so, on what date did you have this engagement with Mr. Teko?
The engagement was on the 14th of April 2015.
And just to confirm the spelling of Mr. Teko's names, you said that his name is Calvin, would that be Calvin,
Yes, that's correct, Chair.
and the surname Theko for Teko?
Yes, that's correct, Chair.
Yes. You were referring the Chair to page 95.
Yes, Chair. Under paragraph 13, and this was the response we had received from Neo Tel on page 95.
And what is the date of that response?
The date of that response is 5th June 2015.
Yes.
So, Chair, under paragraph 13, the response from Neo Tel, the company, was that concerns were raised by Tracy Cohen and Steve Wiley to Sunil Joshi about Tommix, and whether there was knowledge of untoward engagements or facilitation fees to anyone in Transnet. On 20 March, Joshi got the team together to discuss the concerns and asked if anyone knew of any such conduct. Each member was asked and each replied in the negative. Members were also asked if anyone was aware of money changing hands involving employees, and the response was also negative. After the meeting, Teko was asked to do checks on Tommix to assess if any red flags were raised, but none were reported by him. That was the company's response in relation to the background checks that they had done, and was in line with our inquiries of the 14th of April 2015.
Yes, and we will go to correspondence that preceded that letter. Did you know the nature of investigation that was said to have been undertaken by Mr. Teko?
No.
Did you inquire with him as to the nature of the investigation undertaken?
At a high level, yes, but not in detail.
Now, at paragraph 37, you then set out the processes or further processes that Deloitte pursued in its audit. What did Deloitte do in this respect?
Subsequent to us concluding our inquiries on the 14th of April, Mr. Denis raised a formal letter to the board of Neo Tel, making specific inquiries around the Tommix transactions. If I can draw the Chair to annexure.
Before doing so, Mr. Vegela, can I refer you first to paragraph 37, which is on page 10. That is where you set out the further audit process that was undertaken by Deloitte. You then go further to set out the concerns that Deloitte had at this juncture. Can you please take the Chair through these two aspects first?
Okay, Chair, during the audit process, we reviewed various pieces of information around the onboarding process, the contract with Tommix, and other supporting documentation. We had various concerns noted by us as the Deloitte team, and these included the CIPC search on the registration number of Tommix as per the Tommix contract returned no result. Telephone calls made to the specified contract details were unanswered. These were telephone details noted on the onboarding information as well as on the invoice. An internet search on the registered address of Tommix returned an address as being a registered to a charity.
Sorry, Mr. Vagela, before you proceed, I'm informed that the mic is too close to you. Could you please push it slightly forward?
Okay.
Thank you.
Forward or back?
Forward, away from you. Thank you. Please proceed.
The website address mentioned in Tommix's contract did not return a valid web page. The onboarding documentation did not contain all the standard information that was required, such as registration documents, proof of banking details, copies of IDs. The Tommix contract signed by Joshi was also without board approval. And the invoice submitted to Neo Tel's finance department for the first Cisco deal was a payment for a once-off vendor. All these elements in our process of inquiry and in reviewing the information were of concern and were red flags for us.
Then from paragraph 39, you then deal with Deloitte's engagement with the board, the audit committee, and other parties. And in doing so, did you engage any further assistance to assist you in your audit?
Yes, Chair. At this point in time, Mr. Denis engaged external legal counsel, external attorneys, Cliff Decker Hofmeyer, to assist us as him as the signing partner and us as a firm with the legal aspects of the matter due to the significance and complexity around this matter. So we had external legal attorneys assisting us.
Yes, then you deal with a letter that was sent from paragraph 40 of your statement. To whom was this letter sent?
This letter was sent to the chairman of the board of Neo Tel, Mr. Srinath. It was dated the 17th of April, as we were not satisfied with the information and the explanations provided by management. In this letter, we posed a number of questions to the board of Neo Tel in the hope that the answers to these questions would assist us to conclude on whether or not there was an acceptable commercial basis for the Tommix transaction.
And you said that it was the 17th of April. Would this be the 17th of April 2015?
Yes, Chair, that is correct.
Can I refer you then to page 40 of the bundle, which appears under folder number 4. Page 37, pardon me, it's on page 37. Is that the letter that Deloitte sent to the board?
Yes, that is correct, Chair.
And what contents are addressed in this letter to the board?
So we specifically outlined the Tommix contract and the agreement that was signed on the 19th of February. And we specifically asked the management and board to provide information around the commerciality and substance of the arrangement with Tommix. In the letter, there are a number of bullet points asking key questions, such as the selection criteria and the reasons for appointing Tommix, other service providers considered, the credentials and expertise which Tommix possesses. What did Neo Tel's management or the board know exactly what would be done by Tommix or implemented by Tommix in carrying out the mandate? The terms and conditions relating to Tommix's involvement in the price negotiation, the mandate and terms of reference that Neo Tel provided to Tommix, a clear explanation of what Tommix brought to the table, which individual at Tommix did Neo Tel deal or engage with, did Neo Tel require Tommix to engage with any particular individuals at Transnet, and if so, who they were, was Transnet made aware that Neo Tel was going to engage or had engaged Tommix or any other agent in connection with the negotiation and conclusion of the Master Services Agreement. Documentation showing the compliance with the levels of authority as per the board approvals framework, and or showing that there was authority from the board or Neo Tel to transact with Tommix, example, the board resolution or minute, as well as the Neo Tel's own assessment of the Tommix relationship, as this was indicated by the CEO on the Saturday, 11th April, that a process was followed by his team during March to ensure that the payments to Tommix are not irregular by nature.
Yes, and how does that letter conclude?
The letter concludes in that we required the above information to assess the commerciality of the arrangement and to support the fee paid and or payable to Tommix as part of our general duties under auditing legislation. This is required before we can opine to the annual financial statements.
And following this letter, what then took place?
Following this letter, a special audit committee was called for on the 21st of April 2015 in order for us to discuss our concerns relating to the Tommix transaction and the 17th of April letter.
Who called this meeting?
And Neo Tel, the company, called the meeting.
Can I then
Who in the company?
Sorry?
Who in the company called the meeting?
Chair, it would
You were
be-
asked who called the meeting. What was your answer?
I said Neo Tel, the company, called
Neo
the-
Tel.
Yes, Neo
Oh,
Tel,
okay.
yes.
Yes, can I then refer you to page 40 of the bundle, which appears under folder number 5? What document appears at page 40 of the bundle?
It's the minutes of the Emergency Audit Committee meeting of Neo Tel.
And is this the same meeting you've just told the chair about?
Yes, Chair.
And on what date did this meeting take place?
21 April 2015.
So
Who-
this was a meeting of the audit committee of Neo Tel,
Yes, Chair.
and that included you and Mr. Denis.
Yes, Chair, and Michelle Villion.
Yes, okay.
Thank you, Chair. And who else was in attendance at that meeting?
It was Mr. Andre Denis, myself, Michelle Villion, and the audit committee members, Mr. Mimani, Mr. Offner, and Mr. Pham.
Please provide the full names of the committee members.
Mr. Kennedy Mimani, Mr. Robert Peter Offner, Mr. Tri Lu Pham.
And did you attend the meeting at its commencement?
Yes, we did.
Okay, can I refer you to the top of page 40?
Sorry, Chair, sorry. We attended into the meeting. So the meeting was scheduled for 3. We attended at 4:10. Sorry for the correction.
And who led the discussions that took place at the meeting?
Mr. Denis led the discussions at the meeting
And
on behalf of Deloitte.
yes, and what in particular was discussed at this meeting?
So I'm sorry, I just want to understand this. Was it a meeting of Deloitte and a committee of Neo Tel, or members of Deloitte, such as yourself and Mr. Denis, although coming from Deloitte, are members of or were members of the Neo Tel Audit Committee together with people internal at Neo Tel?
Chair, we are not members of the company's committee. We as auditors are invited to the committee meeting, The audit committee meeting was a Neo Tel audit committee meeting where
An internal committee
yes,
at Neo
it's
Tel.
a subcommittee of the board
Yes.
to oversee financial statements and the financial reporting process.
So they were having their own meeting, the audit committee, and at a certain stage, you came to meet with the audit committee. At a certain stage of their meeting, you
Ye-
came to attend their meeting, so that part of their meeting was a meeting between yourselves and the audit committee.
Yes, that's correct, Chair.
Yeah, so that one wasn't just a meeting of the audit committee, but it involved people from Deloitte, and it was a meeting between the two.
Yes, Chair, but the meeting was called for.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes, yes. No, that's fine.
Thank you. And just so to remind ourselves, this meeting was, where you joined the meeting at least as Deloitte, was as a result of your letter dated the 17th of April 2015, wherein you asked certain questions or sought clarification from the chairman of Neo Tel's board.
Chair, the meeting was, the audit committee had called a meeting for us to take them through our concerns and the letter, to brief them about the letter.
And at this meeting, was there any response given to any of the concerns or questions you had raised in your letter of the 17th of April 2015?
The meeting was a briefing meeting where we took them through the inquiries and the responses that we had with management. It was clear from that meeting that the directors were inquiring more into the transactions than they possibly should have, because it was communicated to us that the matter had been approved by the board. So if it had been approved by the board, the members would have more knowledge of the matter. So that was unusual to us. We walked through the
Did you get the impression that they were, those members of the board or those directors were asking more questions, which you say was unusual? Did you get the impression that they were pretending not to know much about the transaction? Is that your concern, or no, or is your concern something else when you say it was unusual?
Well, we don't know. Either they did know and were pretending, or they actually didn't know.
Yeah.
There are two
Okay.
elements to it.
Okay.
We took them through the transactions. There was debate around accounting. There was a debate we raised around our concern around authority, and we kept asking, what Tommix did and what was their mandate. And I think it was more an inquiry meeting from the audit committee members, and we presented the facts as we understood it at that point in time, and we then left the meeting. I think just to make the chair aware, one of the bullets on the minutes regarding this transaction.
Can you just confirm which bullet point?
It's the second last bullet
On page 40,
on page 40. Yes.
the second last from the bottom, yes?
Yeah. Regarding this transaction, Mr. Denis, AD, which is Mr. Denis, therefore explained that no one in management can provide a clear answer as to who Helmick is, what is their scope of work agreed upon, who does Helmick engage with at Transnet, does Transnet know that an agency involved, what their mandate was, what the terms of authority of the price negotiation they had, i.e. the questions raised in the letter to the board.
And the point that follows speaks of the amount in question. Can you please take the chair through the last bullet point on that page?
TLP, which is Trilufam, asked whether we would have a different view if the amount was a fixed amount rather than a percentage of the contract value.
And what was your response to that?
Mr. Denis said it is not relevant because the question remains, what did the agent do for the fee, and what was the commerciality for engaging the agent? the questions in the letter would have remained the same, i.e., whether it's a percentage or a fixed fee. We needed to understand what they did.
And did the audit committee respond to your stance in that respect?
There were various comments made. KM, Mr. Kennedy Mimani, said making use of agents and paying an agent's fees isn't abnormal. And so we had discussion around that, as noted in the minutes. But there wasn't a conclusive answer.
Yes. And you earlier said that at this meeting you also discussed the issue of authority, and that would appear on page 41 where that discussion is set out. Can you please give detail around this discussion?
Yes, we raised with the audit committee that we felt that the CEO did not have the board's authority. The reason for that was the agreement was signed by Neo Tel on the 14th of December. We engaged Tommix on the 12th of December. The note he had provided to the board was dated the 16th of December. And when we look at the delegation of authority, the delegation of authority talks about unbudgeted expenditure having a limit of 10 million rand and budgeted expenditure having a limit of 40 million rand. And the MSA fee of 36 million rand was, in our view, unbudgeted because you had an impasse in December and that value exceeded the 10 million rand. We also, in the extreme circumstances, if you had to take the 36 million rand and the 25 million rand asset sale and add the two together, you will get to an amount of 61 million rand. And that 61 million rand exceeded the 40 million rand limit. So in either way, we didn't believe he had authority, explicit authority as required.
Yes, and you deal with the issue of authority in paragraphs to follow in your statement. Now, on page 41 of the minutes, there was some discussion around the payments and payment dates. Is that correct?
Sorry, Chair, can you repeat it?
Was there any discussion insofar as the payment dates? Perhaps let me refer you to the fifth last bullet point. Please take the chair through that discussion.
Chair, Mr. Pham asked Mr. Denis why Mr. Denis felt comfortable with the first transaction but not the second. Mr. Denis responded that the first payment occurred in April 2014, which was in the current financial year. The first transaction was not selected as part of our audit testing, and we came to find out about the engagement at Hampered during our creditors testing in February 2015. Therefore, the second transaction was included in our testing. The transaction remained to be investigated, but we understand that management said this was a finder's fee based on a deal that was brought to them, and we will still investigating these. So the payment he's referring to is the payment on the Cisco transaction. It was still in the financial year, and we would investigate it subsequently.
Yes, and the discussion appears to have continued. Please take the chair through that.
Mr. Denis also indicated that there was an additional payment that was due of 25 million rand, which we are unclear as to which part of the deal it relates to. CV, Mr. Vagela, explained that the 25 million rand and that the client CFO indicated that it was part of the conclusion of the operating agreement, whereas the CEO indicated it was part of the concluding sale of assets agreement, which agreement had taken place in December 2014 and which should therefore be accrued.
And did you gain any clarity as to what the 25 million rand payment would relate to?
The 25 million rand payment would relate to the sale of assets agreement, which was concluded as part of the MSA and which was subsequently accrued in the 31 March 2015 accounts.
And were you able to establish that as a matter of fact, as according to this discussion, it was the CEO of Neo Tel, who had indicated that the 25 million rand payment was part of the concluding the sale of assets agreement.
Yes, Chair, there was a disconnect between the CEO and the CFO, and the disconnect was because based on the CEO fact pattern, you would need to have accrued it. Based on the CFO fact pattern, one would delay accrual to a bit later. So that was the disconnect in the fact pattern. On looking through the evidence, we concluded that it needed to be accrued. However, we did not get comfortable with the commerciality with that fee as well. It's part of the 36 million rand fee paid, in that we couldn't understand what Tommix did and was there a commercial basis for the fee arrangement.
And how did that meeting conclude?
After we presented our fact pattern, we left the meeting, and the audit committee members would have their own internal discussion on their own, and that's how we left that meeting.
The one thing that Mr. Denis kept on going back to in that meeting was, what did Tommix do? And what authority was, what was their mandate? Is that correct?
Yes, Chair.
And each time, was he not getting any satisfactory answers or any answers at all?
We weren't getting satisfactory answers.
Were you being told what the CFO, the CEO, and Mr. Van der Merwe had told you, namely, they helped to break an impasse between Neo Tel and Transnet? Or were you not being told that at this meeting?
In this meeting, we weren't told that. We were actually giving our version of our inquiries.
What was happening when these questions were put? The board of directors or the committee just kept quiet, or what? Because you went to that question quite a few times, it seems to me. What did Tommix do? What was their mandate? They were mandated to do what?
Chair,
did the committee members just keep quiet, or they avoided answering those questions, or what happened?
they couldn't. If we look at the minutes, that question is never answered.
Yes.
And subsequent to that, the board commissioned an independent investigation.
Yes.
As their process.
But it must have been quite a very strange thing that here was a company that paid very, very large amounts to another company, and the CFO could not tell you what this was for in any satisfactory way. The CEO could not, Mr. Van der Merwe could not, now the audit committee could not. Must have been quite a strange thing.
Yes, Chair, that's why we were concerned.
Yeah. At the end of this meeting, did you and Mr. Denis come to any firm conclusion as to your suspicions or not? Not yet.
Chair, after that meeting, we did come to a conclusion that the audit committee members were not fully aware of the Tommix transaction, and therefore it formed the basis for reporting our first reportable irregularity around the breach of delegation of authority, as well as the commercial, and for the directors to not act in the best interest of the company.
And just for completeness sake, insofar as the audit committee's response to your questions, can you just go through the last 2 bullet points on page 41?
The audit committee said they will discuss this matter further without the attendance of Deloitte or management. Deloitte subsequently left the meeting for the audit committee to discuss on their own.
Thank you. Can we then return to page 12?
Before you do that, You know, the third bullet point at the top of paragraph of page 2041 says KM asked AD why his letter is addressed to the board. Why was that an important issue? Do you know? Was he taking objection to something, KM?
Chair, in our view, if a matter is addressed to the board, it highlights the severity or the significance of the matter. And Mr. Denis responded there that, you know, the CEO, the CFO, Mr. Teko, Mr. van der Merwe could not provide answers or responses to our questions. And that the CEO said to him that board approval was obtained for this transaction. And the board approved the Transnet MSA transaction. And therefore, that's because we weren't getting responses to our inquiries, the next logical step was to escalate it to the board.
And that explanation seemed to satisfy him? Or you don't know?
I wouldn't be able to answer that.
Yeah, okay.
Can we return to your statement at page 12 and paragraph 43, where you set out events that took place subsequent to your meeting with the audit committee of Neo Tel. Can you please take the chair through this?
So subsequent to the 21st April 2015 meeting with the audit committee, Deloitte then evaluated the information it had obtained from management in response to the queries addressed to management in relation to the Tommix transaction and payments made to Tommix. I'm referring here to all our inquiries, the onboarding information, the contracts that we had reviewed. And based on the meeting with the audit committee, we then concluded our first RI as required by the Act, the Auditors Professions Act. Chair, an RI is the Act of Governing Auditors requires us as auditors to act in a certain way, and we have a statutory obligation to report matters where we have reason to believe that management has committed an unlawful act that would have resulted in material financial loss, or is fraudulent or amounts to theft, or is a material breach of fiduciary duties. So in those instances where we have reason to believe, we would need to report an RI. And at this point in time, we had reason to believe that we had an RI regarding, I just want to,
Can I then refer you to page 46, please, of that bundle? Page 43. My apologies, page 43, not 46. You earlier said to the chair that based on your engagement with the audit committee, you then issued your first RI. Is that correct?
yes, Mr. Denis issued the first RI.
Now, at page 43, what document is that?
This is the first RI letter issued by Deloitte, addressed to Urbe on the 28th April 2015.
And what is Deloitte reporting?
So in this RI letter, we articulate the success fee of 36 million rand paid to the agent. We record that the commerciality of this transaction remains unclear. And we're reporting that the contents of our investigation suggest that Section 76(3) of the Companies Act, as well as the common law duty of the directors of the company to act in the best interest of the company, may have been breached. In our opinion, This constitutes an unlawful act or omission committed by any persons responsible for management of an entity, which is likely to cause material financial loss to the entity or to any partner, member, shareholder, creditor, or investor of the entity in respect of their dealings with the entity, is fraudulent or amounts to theft, and represents a material breach of any fiduciary duty owed by such person to the entity or any partner, member, shareholder, creditor, or investor of the entity under any law applying to the entity or conduct or management thereof.
That's fine. And when this first report was sent to Urbe, in preparation of this report, did you engage the assistance of CDH attorneys, whom you earlier said you had engaged in assisting you with this audit process?
Yes, Chair. We had engaged CDH in our correspondence from the first letter of the 17th of April.
Yes. And did Neo Tel receive a copy of this report?
Subsequent to our reporting to Urbe, the board of Neo Tel would have received a copy of this letter.
What then happened after the issuance of this letter?
Subsequent to the issuance of the letter, the board commissioned an independent investigation into the Tommix transactions through Workmen's attorneys. The investigation commenced on the 4th of May 2015.
Before that, detail around the investigation, at paragraph 51 of your statement on page 14, you deal with events that took place on the 16th of May 2015, which relate to a previous occurrence as set out in the preceding paragraph. Please take the chair through these two paragraphs that you have at page 14.
Chair, during the time there were various accounting matters that were impacting the audit, and I had asked one of my trainees to obtain the waiver letter on the EBITDA covenants, which had been received from the lender's agents, from the General Manager, Corporate Finance Treasury, Ms. L.B. van der Merwe. At the time, Ms. van der Merwe made some disparaging comments around Deloitte partners and said that Deloitte partners were pedantic and that we would be the reason for Neo Tel going down. She went further with comments around myself specifically, which are concerning. She is quoted as having said that Chetan must know of xenophobia and that we know that he's a Zimba and we know people that can sort him out.
What happened following that at paragraph 51?
Mr. Denis raised this threat on a Deloitte partner with the chairman on the board on the 16th of May 2015. An apology was received from the chairman and a disciplinary inquiry was followed by Neo Tel.
Would you say that Deloitte was being hampered in its investigation or audit by the employee in question?
I wouldn't say hampered, or it was a bit hostile and non-cooperative.
Yes. You then deal with the Workmen's investigation from paragraph 52 to 58 of your statement. Who initiated this investigation?
The Workmen's investigation was initiated by the board of Neo Tel in order to address the contents of the 17th of April letter.
And on what date did this investigation commence?
It commenced on the 4th of May 2015.
Then in paragraph 53, you deal with events that took place on the 20th of May 2015. What happened on this day?
Chair, in terms of there was correspondence between Neo Tel and Deloitte. The first RI was issued on the 28th of April 2015. In terms of the RI process, we would have a responsibility to issue our second report within 30 days from that date, meaning there was a deadline of 28th May 2015 to issue the second report. Through that process, there was correspondence between between Neo Tel and Deloitte, which is articulated in paragraph 53. So in paragraph 53, we received a letter on the 20th of May, which articulated that the investigation was in process and not complete, and that Transnet had been approached by Neo Tel to assist Neo Tel with its investigation in relation to the Tommix matter.
Yes, can I then refer you to page 97 of the bundle? Are you on that page?
Yes, Chair.
Are you able to identify this document?
Yes, Chair. It's a letter from Transnet to Neo Tel that we had received as part of the 20th May letter from Neo Tel to us.
And what is the date of this letter?
The date of this letter is 19th May 2015.
And who signed this letter?
The letter is signed by Siyabonga Gama, the Acting Group Chief Executive.
It's a very short letter. Can you just read the letter into the record?
Dear Mr. Srinath, Neo Tel Private Limited Master Services Agreement with Transnet SOC Limited. Your letter dated 16th May 2015 and delivered to my office on the 18th May 2015 refers. I have read your letter with great concern regarding its content and alleged implications to both Transnet and Neo Tel. As you know, Transnet is a public-owned entity that is governed by the Public Finance Management Act, among others. As a result, Transnet must ensure that its procurement practices are fair, equitable, transparent, and cost-effective. Therefore, any allegation that purports transgression of the PFMA has to be taken very seriously. Depending on the outcome of your investigation, the possible consequence could include the termination of the contract under caption and the blacklisting of companies involved. Transnet is comfortable and confident of the veracity of its procurement process and that none would have been breached in the award of the contract to Neo Tel. This is because the process of award of such high-value contracts is subject to review by both our internal and external audit process. Should you have any concrete evidence against any Transnet executive having committed any wrongdoing, I invite you to immediately make the evidence of such available to me so that we can conduct an internal investigation, the result of which will determine whether we agree to your request to interview Transnet executives. In order to assist you in the current investigation, we can confirm that it is normal practice for Transnet to engage business consultants or advisors to navigate complex financial, technical, and commercial aspects of transactions. In this regard, we can confirm that Transnet had employed the services of such advisors and were aware of Helmick's similar role on behalf of Neo Tel. Please be guided accordingly. Kind regards, Siyabonga Gama.
And you say that this letter was attached to a letter that Neo Tel had addressed to you.
Yes, that is correct, Chair.
Can I then refer you to page 70 of the bundle, which is under folder number 8. Is that the letter that was sent to Deloitte from Neo Tel?
Yes, Chair.
And what is the date of that letter?
It is the 20th of May 2015.
And who from Neo Tel had sent this letter?
This came from the chairman of the board.
Now, in essence, this response from Neo Tel, did it confirm or refute your first report on the reportable irregularity that you had reported to Urbe?
Sorry, Chair, can you repeat the question?
Did this response from Neo Tel confirm or refute the reportable irregularity that you had reported to Urbe in respect of Neo Tel?
This letter disagreed with our view on the reportable irregularity.
And on what basis did this letter disagree on your view?
In their view, in the view of the directors, they say they were of the view that the investigation does not confirm the breach of a director in terms of Section 76(3). So that was their view in terms of how they were reading in the transaction, and we had to clarify that in subsequent letters.
Yes. And what is the conclusion of Neo Tel's letter to Deloitte?
In this letter, this is the first letter where we have correspondence with Transnet, because part of the accounting considerations was that we asked Neo Tel whether Transnet had known, and they needed to seek a waiver from Transnet. And this letter indicated that Transnet did know of Tommix, but was quite non-cooperational with Neo Tel in this regard.
Did Deloitte then respond to this letter that was sent by Neo Tel, in which they attached Transnet's letter? And in that particular letter, Mr. Siyabonga Gama having stated that they are aware of Tommix. Did Deloitte respond to this letter?
We respond to this letter in Annex to CV9, which is on page 73.
And what is the date of this letter?
The letter is dated 22nd May 2015.
And to whom is it addressed?
It's addressed to the chairman of Neo Tel.
Yes. And what was your response, in essence, to Neo Tel?
In this letter, our response is essentially that, in our view, there was a breach of the delegation of authority, because when we look at the delegation of authority, sorry, can I just have 2 minutes to just clarify? Okay, in this letter, we responded to the board, confirming that the CEO did not have the requisite authority. The transaction needed the board approval, and we hadn't seen a board minute or resolution authorizing the CEO to transact with Tommix. And therefore, we believe that the reportable irregularity was still continuing. We further state that the investigation and inquiry into the Transnet side of the transaction and the Transnet interactions with Tommix is still underway, but yet we still are awaiting definite answers. And what was strange to us was that Neo Tel could not provide readily answers to some of the questions of the 17th of April. They were awaiting completion of the investigation. And ordinarily, some of those questions could be answered at the time, and that seemed strange to us.
Yes, and those questions that you stated could be easily answered. You had set out from paragraph 5.1 to 5.5 of your letter.
Yes, that's correct, Chair.
Can you just take the Chair through that list?
We said, for example, the selection criteria and reasons for appointing Tommix as a consultancy firm agent, other service providers which were considered by Neo Tel in this process, the credentials and expertise which Tommix possesses and which warranted its engagement by Neo Tel in connection with the Master Services Agreement with Transnet. Did any member of Neo Tel's management or board at any stage inquire from Tommix what exactly would be done, undertaken, and or implemented by Tommix in carrying out its mandate in connection with the negotiation and or conclusion of the Master Services Agreement? If so, how did Tommix respond to the above inquiry What did it communicate to Neo Tel and that it would do, undertake or implement in carrying out its mandate in connection with negotiating and or conclusion of the Master Services Agreement?
Yes. And so in essence, as of the 22nd of May 2015, Deloitte had still not received satisfactory answers to their letters or concerns raised as early as April 2015. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
And did Neo Tel respond to your letter?
Chair, they did on the 26th of May 2015.
Can I refer you to page 78 of the bundle, which appears under the folder number 11? Can you please identify that document?
It's a letter from Neo Tel addressed to Mr. Andre Denis.
Yes. And is this the letter that was sent in response to Deloitte's letter of the 22nd of May 2015?
Yes, that is correct.
And what was Neo Tel saying to Deloitte in response?
In this letter, they were still disputing the authority that the CEO had. And their view was that it was within his day-to-day operations, or day-to-day operations authority,
Yes.
which we disagreed with.
And in reply and stating that this was within the day-to-day operations, did Neo Tel apply itself to any threshold limitations that might apply in line with any delegation of authority?
No, they did not in this letter.
And did Neo Tel refer you to any resolution that might have been passed by the company in line with entering into the Master Services Agreement?
No resolution or minute had been provided.
Can I refer you to page 79 at paragraph 3.6 of that letter? Can you please take the chair through that paragraph?
On the 24th October 2014, the board passed a resolution authorizing the company to enter into the Master Services Agreement with Transnet SOC Limited upon the terms set out in paragraph 8.6.5 of the board minute. The authority concluded with the following statement that Mr. Sunil Joshi, in his capacity as Managing Director / CEO, be and he is hereby authorized with the power of substitution to take all necessary steps to give effect to the above resolutions, including the authority to sign all documents and contracts for and on behalf of the company.
And so if one is to understand that Neo Tel's stance in this letter was that the board had passed the resolution authorizing the company to enter into the MSA.
Yes, that was the defense.
And that authority was given to Mr. Sunil Joshi.
Yes, in their view.
Yes. And the letter then goes on to respond to some of the concerns that you had raised. Can you please summarize the reply that Neo Tel provided to Deloitte?
Sorry, Chair, in which letter are you referring to?
We're still on the same letter of the 26th of May 2015, which was sent by Neo Tel to Deloitte. And you have just taken the chair through their response relative to a resolution that is said to have been passed. The letter then goes on to speak to certain concerns that you had raised, and I was requesting you to summarize the response that Neo Tel provided to Deloitte.
The letter then continues to just outline the steps that had been taken. So on the 30th of November, the CEO had provided an update to the board. On the 16th of December 2014, the CEO had reported to the board on the successful conclusion. And in that paragraph, there's mention of increased cost. So it says that this resulted in increased cost due to gold sites, increased SLAs, as well as the engagement of the consultant Tommix to assist us with negotiations and closure of the contract. We were also made aware that Transnet may also have been negotiating with a competitor in order to reduce the risks should the negotiations with Neo Tel fail or not conclude, and understand that a parallel offer was made by them to Transnet as an alternative to Neo Tel. This was considered a threat. This is the reference the CEO had made in terms of his board approval of Tommix.
And as at this point, when you received this letter, was Deloitte satisfied of all the concerns that they had raised in their earlier correspondence?
No, we were not. We would expect a bit more specifics around Helmick, the quantum of the fee, the scope of the services. This was an update note to the board, noting them on the conclusion of the contract. And the timing of it was also after the event.
And so did you engage Neo Tel any further in response to their letter?
We did, Chair. We issued a letter dated the 27th of May 2015, which is on page 82, annexure CV12.
And what were you raising in that letter?
In this letter, we raised that we were not convinced that the conclusion of the mandate was a day-to-day, was within the day-to-day management of Neo Tel. And the rationale behind that was that if the CEO had the requirement to obtain approval for the Transnet Master Services Agreement, that would also extend to the Helmick mandate based on the quantum and the value. We then articulate that in terms of the DOA, expenditure outside the annual operating plan, which cannot wait for board approval, has a limit of 10 million rand. And expenditure in line with the annual operating plan, which exceeds 40 million, requires board approval. So thus, even if it's argued that the mandate is in line with the day-to-day management, the amount was still exceeded by some 21 million rand if you take the 36 million rand and 25 million rand Helmick fees.
Yes, and in respect of the mandate that was referred to by Neo Tel in its letter, you address yourself the same from paragraph 5 of your letter, is that correct? That appears on page 83.
Sorry, Chair, can you repeat the question?
At paragraph 5 of your letter, which starts at page 83, you reply to Neo Tel's response in relation to the mandate, is that correct?
Yes, that is correct.
And you make reference to the amount in question, is that correct?
Yes, that is correct.
Now, at 5.3 to 5.5, that is where, to 5.6 rather, that is where you speak to the issue of the mandate relative to the amount. Can you please take the chair through those paragraphs?
Sure. 5.3 says, however, the mandate is clearly a standalone significant contract in its own right with a third party involving a very substantial payment obligation to that third party of 61 million rand. 36 million rand of which has been paid and 25 million rand of which remains payable as at the date of this letter. Nowhere in the board resolution is the mandate referred to. Further, the board resolution in question deals with its subject matter in rather specific detail, with specific items and amounts in connection with the Transnet agreement being mentioned and approved. Example, the conditions that revenue of 900 million or more is reached over 3 years, CapEx does not exceed 140 million over 3 years, of which 120 million will be spent in year 1. There will be a mobilization fee of 50 million rand for year 1. This level of detail in its entirety is inconsistent with the notion that the board granted the CEO a wide and general power to conclude all and any agreements on the contrary. It suggests that the resolution would have specifically minuted and approved the mandate if that was indeed the board's intention. Therefore, in our view, The board resolution quite simply cannot be interpreted as authorizing the mandate even implicitly or indirectly.
Yes, and what was said in conclusion in that letter? You may paraphrase it, you do not need to read it.
In conclusion, I mean, we disagreed with the board in that the CEO had the authority to execute the Tommix mandate. And our RI remained, we reported as continuing.
Yes. Now, following...
I'm sorry, even at this stage, they still couldn't tell you what Tommix had done. Is that correct?
Yes, Chair, because the investigation was still in process.
Yeah, and it's quite strange this when even the board can't tell you what somebody that the company has paid a lot of money did. They have to get people from outside to just answer that simple question. And did they answer the question, what mandate was given to Tommix to do? By this time, had that question been answered? And who had given the mandate to Tommix?
At this date, no, Chair.
Yeah. Okay.
Now, following all this correspondence that was exchanged with Neo Tel, at paragraph 57 of your statement on page 15, you then speak about a meeting that took place. Is that correct?
Yes, Chair.
When did this meeting take place?
This meeting took place on the 26th of May, 2015.
And who was in attendance at that meeting?
I can't recall all the parties, but it was a meeting at Norton Rose Fulbright, where we had the audit committee members and Mr. Denis and myself. Yeah, but I cannot confirm all the parties in that meeting, together with Neo Tel's attorneys.
And what was the purpose of this meeting?
The purpose of this meeting was to discuss the information around the workmen's investigation being legally privileged, and the lawyers and the audit committee were assessing what Deloitte would require in order to conclude on the audit.
And can you just confirm who the law firm Norton Rose Fulbright was representing?
Norton Rose Fulbright was representing Neo Tel. The investigators were Workmen's.
And you say that the discussion was in respect of documents that you were seeking pursuant to the Workmen's investigation.
Yes, as part of the Workmen's investigation, there would be a report that would get issued, which we would need to review and assess in order to conclude on this matter. And at this point in time, the issue that was being raised was this information is legally privileged.
And when you say the issue being raised, one would assume that it would be Norton Rose raising this issue.
Norton or the company Neo Tel.
Yes. And was there any specific document which was said to be legally privileged, or were you to understand that all the documents that were used in the Workmen's investigation were legally privileged?
In our view, it would be all the documentation in the Workmen's investigation.
And for what purpose did you require these documents?
So Mr. Denis and I indicated that we required the results of the investigation that had been initiated by the board in order to conclude on the Tommix matter, and if such information was not forthcoming, our audit opinion would have been a disclaimer of opinion.
Yes. And you would have relayed this to Norton Rose or Neo Tel?
We communicated this to the audit committee of Neo Tel.
And how did that meeting conclude?
The meeting was just one of the. We didn't have a conclusion because there was between Neo Tel and Deloitte there were various correspondence that would engage on matters, so there isn't a definite conclusion on it. But but what we took away from that is that the information was being restricted and we potentially wouldn't have access. And so the impact of that would result in a disclaimer opinion, and the Audit Committee of Neo Tel needed to consider the impact and how they would want to resolve that.
Before moving on to what happened after this meeting, can you just briefly explain what a disclaimer opinion would be in simple terms?
A disclaimer opinion is one which doesn't give any assurance, and the users of the financial statements would not be able to rely on those financial statements. You get to a disclaimer opinion where you have a material and pervasive issue that impacts financial statements as a whole in getting to a disclaimer.
Yes. Now, at this meeting, did it ever become clear, or were you ever informed by Neo Tel or the attorneys, Norton Rose, what Tommix had done to be paid the amounts that they were paid?
No, we still do not have answers to that question.
What happened after that meeting?
After that meeting, we reported the first RI as continuing in the letter dated 28 May 2015, and as required in terms of the Act.
Can I then refer you to page 87 of the bundle, which appears under folder number 13, on Exhibit BB9. Are you there?
Yes, Chair.
What document appears at page 87?
87 is the second report on the first RI, dated 28 May 2015.
And what is contained in that report?
In that report, we articulate that the Board of Neo Tel has commissioned an investigation, and that investigation is ongoing. However, the success fees of 36 million and further 25 million that needed to be accrued still remains unsupported and unclear, and the commerciality of this transaction remains unclear. And at that stage, we had reason to believe that the RI is still continuing, and that the agreement with the agent was not duly authorized in terms of the delegation of authority, and nor was it subsequently ratified by the board.
Yes. Now, subsequent to the issuance of the second RI, did Deloitte engage Neo Tel any further?
Deloitte didn't engage Neo Tel. Neo Tel responded on the 5th of June with further information.
And what further information was provided?
So Deloitte received a letter on the 5th of June, which is on page 90, Annex to CV 14, which outlines Neo Tel's summary of findings of the workmen's investigations and answering the questions that Deloitte had posed in CV4.
Yes, and what is being communicated to Deloitte in that letter?
In that letter, it's communicated that Mr. Francois van der Merwe had engaged in a clandestine relationship with Tommix, and it articulates responses to our questions raised on the 17th of April.
And in this letter, is this clandestine relationship described, or the extent of that relationship?
Chair, if I can quote from the letter, by way of general background to the detailed responses set out in this document, Neo Tel records the information has become available as a consequence of forensic analysis of data over the last 2 weeks. This provides prima facie evidence that Mr. Francois van der Merwe, General Manager Strategic Customers, has engaged in a clandestine relationship with Tommix and persons related to that entity for a period from at least February 2014 through to the time of the conclusion of the negotiations between Neo Tel and Transnet SOC Limited, and probably through to the present time. Francois has consistently maintained and continues to maintain his discussions with investigators that these interactions with Tommix or any representatives of the entity were limited to 2 periods. The first of these was in respect of the transaction for the sale of equipment by Neo Tel to Transnet in February and March 2014. He maintained that thereafter he had no further contact with Tommix until he was requested by Sunil Joshi to reach out to Tommix on the afternoon of Thursday, 11 December. The purpose was to seek the assistance of Tommix in resolving the impasse which had arisen between Neo Tel and Transnet in regard to the conclusion of the Master Services Agreement between Neo Tel and Transnet because of the breakdown in the negotiation process. The analysis of data, however, reveals ongoing contact between Francois and Tommix representatives during the course of 2014. More particularly, on the morning of 11 December 2014, Francois provided Tommix with confidential internal emails of Neo Tel's. These were briefing documents prepared by Neo Tel management for Joshi, who had curtailed his trip to India and returned to South Africa early that morning.
Can I then refer you to page 91 of that letter, where from the second paragraph from the top,
Yeah.
Neo Tel is reporting what the full import of this clandestine relationship and dealings between Mr. Van der Merwe and Tommix were. Can you briefly take the chair through this aspect?
The full import of this clandestine relationships and the dealings between Francois and Tommix remained unclear. In order to get clarity on that, impending disciplinary proceedings were initiated by Neo Tel. However, Francois had resigned with immediate effect on the 4th of June 2015. And Neo Tel sought advice in regard to this exercise of civil remedies against Tommix and the nature of and basis for any reporting obligations it may have under applicable legislation arising out of this matter.
Yes, and the letter goes on to address the questions that were raised by Deloitte, still on page 91. Paragraph 1.1 and 1.2 of that letter sets out the background to the MSA contract. Is that correct?
Yes, Chair.
And at paragraph 1.3, that is where the letter starts to address the background of the involvement of Tommix in relation to Neo Tel. Is that correct?
Yes, Chair.
Can you take the chair through paragraph 1.3 of that letter?
So on the 5th of December, Harris Newpen, attorneys who were part of the Transnet negotiation team, advised that Transnet were not prepared to negotiate any further, and that Neo Tel either signed
I'm sorry, I missed what page you said?
Pardon me, Chair, we're at page 91,
91.
paragraph 1.3 on that page.
Okay, thank you. You may proceed.
You can start from the beginning, paragraph 1.3.
On 5th December, Harris Newpen, attorneys who were part of the Transnet negotiation team, advised that Transnet were not prepared to negotiate any further, and that either Neo Tel signed the agreement in its present format, or the negotiations would be at an end. Whilst negotiating fatigue was acknowledged to be present, the reasons for Transnet intransigence were not apparent to the Neo Tel team or management. The fact that Gerrie van der Westhuizen, the leading technical member of the Transnet negotiation team, had resigned but remained on after he was due to have left Transnet's employer on the 30th November was an added concern. Tensions were further escalated by the unintended consequences of the rendition by Neo Tel to Transnet of an invoice for services which produced an irate response from Transnet on the 8th of December. At this junction, Mr. Joshi, who was away overseas and due to return on the 12th of December, arranged to cut short his trip to return in the early morning of 11 December. Francois had travelled to Durban on the 8th of December to meet Anuj Singh in Durban to deal with the fallout in regard to the December invoicing and to endeavour to get the negotiations to recommence. Thereafter, a meeting was set up for Singh to meet with Joshi on Thursday, 11 December in the early afternoon.
Yes. It then continues on the following page, page 92. Chair, it is now 1 o'clock. I don't know if we can take the long adjournment now or conclude on this letter first.
Let's take the lunch adjournment now, and we'll resume at 2. We adjourn.
Thank you, Chair.